Okay, so here is my human sexuality and male and female anatomy presentation. So first, um, let's look at the first thing. So, what is human sexuality? So, according to the New World Encyclopedia, human sexuality is the expression of sexual sensation and related intimacy between human beings. And the people that would research that or study that would be sexologists or another, in layman's terms, sex researchers. So, a big part of human sexuality is the intimacy between human beings. And in order to figure out how they're getting intimately physically, we need to look at the reproductive anatomy. So, first, let's look at two crash course videos of the female reproductive anatomy and the male reproductive anatomy.
Maybe you've noticed that every time we talk about a new system, we highlight its importance by saying how you die without it. Like, without your muscular and skeletal systems, you collapse into an inert bag of goo. Or how, if we magically removed your respiratory or circulatory system, you'd die in a couple of minutes because your cells wouldn't have oxygen. That's because most of our body's systems are just trying to keep us alive minute to minute. But one of those systems doesn't really care if you live or die, at least not until it's done its job. It's how every living thing gets its start, but it doesn't really kick in until puberty, and even then, it's more concerned about investing in the future than keeping you alive. When it comes to your reproductive system, it's not concerned about you so much as it's concerned about your alleles, your genetic code, and the future of the human species, which are no small stakes. This system includes our primary internal sex organs, the gonads, like testes and ovaries, the various sex hormones they secrete, and the gametes, sperm and eggs, they produce. It also includes the glands, ducts, external genitalia, and particular brain parts that help the gonads and gametes do what they need to do, which basically is mate, combine alleles, and make babies. Now, all animals have their own particular and fascinating anatomical methods for getting their gametes together, and we could do a whole course just on that and never run out of material, and let me tell you, I would like to do that. But while we may seem kind of tame compared to animals that turn bright red or bite off penises or starve themselves for a chance to breed, our systems are still pretty complex. In fact, it's going to take most of the month to get through all of our various anatomical parts and hormones and explain how sexy time, fertilization, pregnancy, and development work, starting today with the female anatomy. And remember, this is nothing to be shy about. When talking about sex, we're talking about the future of humanity. So when we talk about sex, we're talking about spreading our alleles around, but when we visualize sex, most of what we picture are our anatomies. Who has what and what goes where. In an anatomical female, that involves the vulva, which includes the mons pubis over the pubic bone, and labia majora and labia minora, the elongated skin folds that surround the vestibule, which contains both the urethral and vaginal openings. Beyond that is the vagina, which I'm sure you know is how menstrual blood and babies leave the body and how sperm gets in. But as much as we tend to put all the focus on the bathing suit parts, those are only the genitalia, the external sexual organs. And they're really just a means of getting gametes together. Reproductively speaking, they're the least important parts of the system. The ground control of the female reproductive anatomy, the place where the orders are given, are of course the ovaries. Their main job is to produce and release female gametes and sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. You'll remember from biology that gametes are haploid cells, meaning that they only have one set of chromosomes and are formed by meiosis. When a sperm fuses with an egg, they make a diploid cell, which has all the genetic instructions required to make a baby, and pretty much everything about how our reproductive systems work is designed to make that happen. Each ovary lives inside a fibrous sac that consists of a layer of connective tissue called the tunica albuginea and another layer of cuboidal epithelial cells called the germinal epithelium, which is actually part of the peritoneum that lines the abdominal cavity. The ovary itself contains a cortex that houses developing eggs and a medulla that contains most of the ovary's blood vessels and nerves. So the business of passing on alleles and saving humanity really begins in the basic reproductive units in the cortex, the ovarian follicles. These are tiny sac-like structures that each hold a single primary oocyte, a sort of incomplete proto-egg, along with a bunch of supporting follicle cells around it. Females are born with essentially all of these early versions of eggs and all of the primordial follicles they will ever have, around 1 million at the time of birth. But right around birth, the oocytes stop developing. They get stuck at the first stage of meiosis, and they stay that way for years, sometimes forever. The actual process of egg creation, or oogenesis, is delayed until puberty when the rest of the body is physically ready to reproduce. Now this works differently for us than it does for some other animals, like if you're a salmon or a mayfly, then all of your eggs will mature at once, and then you'll mate, reproduce, and usually die in quick succession. I mean, people talk about living fast and dying young, but that's too fast. So human eggs mature one by one, almost constantly, doled out so that every month or so a mature egg is either fertilized or dies to make way for a new egg. This should all sound familiar if you were born with female anatomy or know anyone who was, because it's a big part of the well-known monthly menstrual cycle. But the truth is, menstruation is only one part of one cycle. The menstrual cycle is what happens in the uterus to prepare for a fertilized egg. The other cycle, the ovarian cycle, is all about the maturation of the follicle and egg, and it's what actually drives the menstrual cycle. Every day, even before birth, a bunch of follicles will begin a process of maturation, very slowly morphing from primordial follicles into what's known as late tertiary follicles, which are the ones that will support a fully developed egg. This process takes 375 days. But out of that bunch of follicles, usually about 20 or so, only one follicle will end up supporting a single mature egg. The rest won't get the hormonal boost they need to bring the egg to completion. This is what happens to the ones that start maturing before puberty, for example. So they undergo atresia, a kind of programmed self-destruction. And because I keep mentioning puberty, which you've probably been through yourself, it should come as no surprise that all of this activity is regulated by sex hormones. Starting around puberty, the hypothalamus and pituitary set up two concurrent cycles: the ovarian cycle in the ovaries, which ripens eggs and secretes sex hormones, and the menstrual, or the uterine cycle, which prepares the uterus to capture and nourish any mature, fertilized eggs. When puberty begins, the hypothalamus starts up the ovarian cycle by secreting gonadotropin-releasing hormone about once a month. This is a sex hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to release two more hormones: follicle-stimulating hormone, you'll often hear it called FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. The follicle-stimulating hormone lives up to its name by stimulating the growth of a follicle, but only one, the one that happens to be the furthest along in development at the time. The FSH drives that one lucky follicle to keep growing by triggering the follicle itself to secrete its own estrogen hormones, which locally signal the follicle to mature even more. That surge of follicle-secreted estrogen then ends up stimulating the pituitary to secrete another pulse of luteinizing hormone to finish the job. The LH gets to work on the oocyte that's been dormant inside the follicle and triggers it to finally start dividing again, getting it to complete meiosis 1 and move on to metaphase 2. This whole process takes about 14 days, at the end of which the follicle, which is now mature, pushes up against the ovary wall, ruptures, and with the help of enzymes breaches the wall and ejects a single, now mature oocyte. Congratulations! You've just ovulated. The damaged follicle now slows its estrogen production while morphing into a different structure called the corpus luteum, which eventually degenerates. But first, it releases its final hormonal swan song, a bunch of progesterone, a little bit of estrogen, and some inhibin that together stop the release of FSH and LH. They also prepare the uterus to receive the oocyte, which is now on its way down a fallopian tube where it might meet a nice young sperm. The tubes are about 10 centimeters long, and interestingly, they aren't actually connected to the ovaries. This means that when the egg pushes through the ovary, it has to float a short way through the peritoneal cavity before it's caught up by a fallopian tube. Now, only if and when an egg fuses with a sperm does it actually complete meiosis 2 and officially become an ovum. But whether it's fertilized or not, the egg works its way down the tube until it enters the uterus, a hollow, thick-walled, and very stretchable muscular organ that sits anterior to the rectum and posterior-superior to the bladder and ends with the cervix. And the uterine wall is composed of 3 layers: the perimetrium on the outside, the bulky, smooth muscle myometrium that contracts during labor, and the inner mucosal lining, the endometrium, which consists of a thin, deep basal layer and an outer functional layer. If fertilization does happen, then the new embryo snuggles into the endometrium for gestation, but the uterus is only receptive to implantation for a short time, about a week after ovulation. If the egg isn't fertilized, that outer functional layer sloughs off. And that's the first phase of the uterine or menstrual cycle, the series of changes that the endometrium goes through every 28 days or so in response to changing hormone levels and in coordination with the ovarian cycle. The shedding of the functional layer is triggered when the progesterone and estrogens that were being produced by the corpus luteum start to drop, about 10 days after ovulation. This phase lasts about 5 days. Meanwhile, the FSH and LH released from the anterior pituitary start to rise again, stimulating the next round of follicles, which begin to make estrogen. This heralds the start of phase 2 of the menstrual cycle, the proliferative or pre-ovulatory phase, which typically lasts from days 6 to 14 of the cycle. The rising estrogen levels in the follicles stimulate the regeneration of the endometrium, building a cushy, well-vasculated vascularized habitat for another potential fertilized egg to call home. And after the next egg is released, the final secretory or post-ovulatory phase begins. This is when the ruptured follicle forms in the corpus luteum, and if fertilization didn't happen, the corpus will stop producing progesterone and the endometrium will start to shed its functional layer and it starts all over again. But if by this time the egg has met a nice sperm and gotten fertilized, then the pulse of progesterone from the corpus triggers even more thickening of the functional layer of the endometrium and a secretion of nutrients that will tide an embryo over until it has implanted itself in the blood-rich lining. Which is a big if, like its whole separate video big, so that's where we're gonna go next time. But for now, you learned all about female reproductive anatomy, how sex hormones affect oogenesis and ovulation, and how the ovarian and menstrual cycles mature and release oocytes and create a comfy uterine environment for a fertilized egg. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Linnea Boyav, and thank
Okay, so then let's move on to the male productive anatomy. Just wait for this ad here to go by.
Nice doll. That's what you think.
And there we go. Never mind. Just one more.
Sex
There we go.
is a big gamble. I mean, the mental risks alone that we take with our relationships are taxing enough. When is he going to text me back? Am I good enough? What if she doesn't like the real me? But the emotional price we pay for
Let's get
intimacy
into
can
the
almost
meat of
seem
this.
paltry compared to the physical investments dedicated to dealing with that one cell for almost a month. And if it gets fertilized, you're looking at 10 months. So when it comes to playing the reproductive roulette wheel, the male reproductive system takes the opposite strategy. If female gametes amount to a high-stakes bet, the males are basically the penny slots. Human sperm are only about 100,000th the mass of an egg, and they're almost as easy to produce as skin cells. Actually, the process by which they mature is pretty similar. That's because sperm are small and stripped down, not invested in much beyond a nucleus and a tail and some extra mitochondria to fuel the journey. All they have to do is drop their DNA and fall apart. The risk of failure is still there. In fact, with male gametes, the odds are overwhelmingly against any single sperm actually accomplishing its mission. But while the female reproductive system meets this risk head-on with a single big play, the males tries to beat the odds with sheer force of numbers. Here's a question for you. Why are the most important parts of the male's reproductive system literally left hanging? The testes, the gonads of the anatomical male, are tasked with making male gametes, sperm, and the androgen hormone testosterone. But unlike the ovaries, which are protected inside the body, testicles dangle outside the abdominal cavity in the scrotum. Because, even though sperm may not be terribly big or complex, they're touchy when it comes to temperature. The rate at which they divide, copy DNA, and even feel the effects of some hormones are all diminished at the core body temperature of 37 degrees. The testes have to be outside the body cavity to reach the lower temperature necessary for proper spermatogenesis or sperm production. It's a rare instance of sensitivity among what are otherwise pretty hardy and expendable cells. But that's not to say that the testes aren't complex. Each one is divided into about 250 sections called lobules, which are loaded with tightly coiled seminiferous tubules. These tubules are the sperm factories, made of a stratified epithelium surrounding a central fluid-filled lumen. And this sperm-making work is supported by cells throughout and around the tubules. Among the most important are the Sertoli cells inside the tubes, which nourish developing sperm cells, sort of like how female follicle cells help oocytes. There are also Leydig cells that secrete testosterone, much like the corpus luteum that secretes estrogen. But compared to egg making, spermatogenesis is, as I mentioned, a pretty cheap and easy process biologically. It's kind of like how your skin cells are produced, with stem cells at the basal layer that produce immature cells, which in turn get forced toward the surface as they mature. But in this case, the sperm develop on the outer edge of the tubule and progress inward toward the lumen. And it all begins with a trigger that, if you've seen our lesson on female reproduction, should look pretty familiar. A hormonal cascade. When puberty comes a-knockin', the hypothalamus starts releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, and this tells the anterior pituitary to secrete follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone into the blood, just like in females. But in females, LH leads to the release of estrogen in the follicles, whereas in males, it spurs the Leydig cells to release testosterone. Meanwhile, the FSH triggers the Sertoli cells to release androgen binding protein, or ABP. This binds to the testosterone, creating large local concentrations of the stuff, which is ultimately what triggers the production of sperm. The targets of the testosterone are the outermost cells in the tubules, called spermatogonia. They're the stem cells that set the sperm-making process in motion by dividing. And actually, they've been doing that all along, even before puberty. Throughout childhood, a spermatogonia cell uses mitosis to continually divide into two identical daughter cells. So when puberty starts, the testosterone causes them to divide differently. Instead of splitting into two identical spermatogonia cells, they begin producing two distinct spermatogonia. One type of daughter cell, known as a type A cell, stays up near the basal lamina and just keeps dividing so you never run out of spermatogonia. The other kind, the type Bs, get pushed down the tubule toward the lumen and turn into primary spermatocytes. These primary spermatocytes then go into meiosis I and form two smaller haploid cells called secondary spermatocytes. They then rush through meiosis II, and their resulting daughter cells total 4 round spermatids. These spermatids now have all of the 23 chromosomes they need for fertilization, but they aren't exactly mobile. If they're ever going to find themselves an egg, they need a way to get around. They need a tail. The process by which a spermatid elongates, grows a tail or flagellum, and officially becomes a mobile sperm is called spermiogenesis. And the whole process takes about 5 weeks, but it's not like it holds anything up because there are plenty more where those spermatids came from. In the end, each primary spermatocyte gives rise to 4 actual sperm, and considering how many spermatogonia are continuously dividing into spermatocytes, it's easy to see how a mature male can crank out 1,500 sperm a second. That's a far cry from all the investment that goes into making a single ovum. Now, obviously, if sperm are going to get anything accomplished, they have to leave the seminiferous tubules that made them, so even once they have tails, they still need a little help getting going. That's why each tubule is surrounded by several layers of myoid cells, which, like smooth muscle, rhythmically contract using peristalsis to squeeze sperm and some fluid secreted by the Sertoli cells through all the twists and turns toward their next destination, the rete testis in the posterior testis. From there, the sperm, although still immobile, leave the testes by way of the epididymis, a long tangled set of tubes behind the testes where they'll spend the next few weeks gaining their mobility. The bulk of the epididymis consists of the enormous duct of the epididymis, which, believe it or not, could be uncoiled to stretch about 6 meters. Though I don't suggest doing that. This duct is full of tiny microvilli called stereocilia, which provide a huge surface area to help reabsorb some extra fluid and help pass along nutrients to feed the idling sperm. It takes sperm nearly 20 days to work their way through this labyrinth, during which time they continue to mature. Once through the duct, they enter the inferior epididymis, where they gain mitochondria, so they'll have energy to swim hard at a moment's notice. At this point, they have all the hardware to swim, but still lack the ability to actually move on their own, a skill kept under wraps until they leave the epididymis and get activated by a series of glandular secretions. When that time comes, during ejaculation, the sperm flow from the epididymis through the vas deferens, a tube that travels up behind the bladder and joins with the duct from the seminal gland to create the ejaculatory duct. The left and right ejaculatory ducts pass into the prostate gland, where they empty into the urethra, which runs from the bladder through the penis and into the outside world. This system of tubes feeding into tubes allows all of the necessary glands to make their contributions to a moving wave of seminal fluid that helps sperm mature and perform their ultimate function, fertilization. The resulting mix of sperm, testicular fluid, and gland secretions, which we call semen, provides sperm with transportation, nutritional energy, chemical protection, and finally, activates their motility. So let's take a look at these glands. The seminal vesicles are a pair of small, hollow glands behind the bladder that secrete a yellowish, slightly alkaline fluid that contains coagulating enzymes, fructose, and other things to help nourish and transport sperm. Interestingly, the vesicles also secrete special prostaglandins that help increase sperm success outside the body by decreasing the viscosity of a female's cervical mucus and actually triggering a reverse peristalsis of the uterus that helps draw sperm up the female reproductive tract. Now, the prostate gland encircles the urethra just inferior to the bladder. During ejaculation, it contracts to squeeze its own special secretion into the urethra. This stuff contains mainly citric acid and an enzyme cocktail that helps keep semen liquefied and thus easier to move and swim through. And finally, we have the pea-sized bulbourethral glands below the prostate that secrete a clear mucus that drains into the urethra to clear out any acidic urine prior to ejaculation. Speaking of, by now you may be wondering if we're ever going to get to what's probably the first thing you think of when it comes to the male anatomy. The penis hangs from the perineum, between the pubic bone and coccyx. It consists of a shaft that ends in an enlarged tip called the glans penis, surrounded by a fleshy cuff of foreskin. Internally, the penis contains 3 layers of erectile tissues, each wrapped in a layer of dense fibrous connective tissue. This spongy network is made of connective tissue and smooth muscle that's full of tiny vascular spaces that fill with blood during sexual arousal and make the penis expand and become rigid. The resulting erection is what helps the penis penetrate the vagina. And the fact that we're only now getting around to talking about it here at the end should tell you that, as with the female external genitalia, the penis isn't actually all that important in terms of overall reproductive function. Evolutionarily speaking, it's just a delivery system designed to get male gametes as close as possible to female gametes and reap some payoff for their investments. Now, what that payoff looks like in terms of fertilization is where we're headed next week. But for now, you learned probably all you'd ever care to know about.
Okay, so let's move on to the next thing, which is the Masters and Johnson's model of sexual response. Now, Masters and Johnson were two sexologists, or sex researchers, and they delved deep into the physical research into how our bodies react to sexual intimacy. So this model describes the changes that the human body physically goes through before, during, and after intercourse. So the first stage is excitement. So this happens differently for both male and female. So for females, the uterus elevates, there's vaginal lubrication, the clitoris swells, and the labia majora and minora swell and deepen in color. The labia majora also separates from the vaginal opening. In men, the penis becomes erect, testes elevate towards the perineum, and the skin of the scrotum tenses, thickens, and elevates. For stage 2, that's called the plateau stage. For females, the uterus elevates even higher, the upper part of the vagina expands, the vaginal wall forms the orgasmic platform, and the color of the labia deepens further, and the clitoris hides underneath the clitoral hood. For men, color of the penile glands deepens, the Cowper's gland activates and creates a secretion, the testes increase in size and are fully elevated now, and the prostate enlarges as well, and the scrotum thickens and tenses. Stage 3 is now finally the orgasm stage. So the female, the uterus contracts, rhythmic contractions in the vagina, the anal sphincter contracts as well, and the clitoris remains underneath the hood. For men, the sperm is expelled by rhythmic contractions of the urethra, the penile or the shaft contracts, the rectal sphincter contracts just like a female, and the internal sphincter of the bladder contracts, and the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland also contract. Now the final stage is the resolution stage. This is when everything's like dying down now, so the uterus will lower, the orgasmic platform will go away, the vagina returns to normal, and the clitoris returns to an unaroused position. The male, same thing, the penis returns to its unstimulated state, the testes lower, and the scrotum thins, and folds return in the scrotum. And that is basically the model of sexual response. And that is my works cited. This is from the definition was from the New World Encyclopedia, and all that information I just gave you was from the book Human Sexuality, Diversity in Contemporary America. And thanks.